So we're gonna be doing another extremely wholesome individual. We are going to learn about the surprisingly mysterious life of Bob Ross. I will admit, other than I think he was in the military, I really don't know anything about Bob Ross. So I am very interested in his life. So let's learn about, at least on screen, one of the kindest men on TV.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching the Today I Found Her YouTube channel, and in the video today we're looking at the surprisingly mysterious life of artist Bob Ross. Amongst the pantheon of notable public television personalities, Bob Ross easily ranks alongside the likes of Mr. Rogers and Elmo as a star who is almost universally loved and respected by the public. Despite being famous the world over for his balmy, soothing demeanor, his show The Joy of Painting, and his amazing fro, we know surprisingly little about arguably one of the best-known artists of modern times. This is partially because, for some reason, nobody ever really asked Bob Ross to do any interviews, and he only gave a handful of them over the course of his life. In fact, in one of the surprisingly few quotes that come from the man himself and don't come from his show, he stated, "I never turn down requests for interviews. I'm just rarely asked." However, in another interview Ross gave,
I bet I know why. I would bet I will bet you I know why he was rarely asked for interviews. Probably because at the time, journalists probably did not think that he would. Yeah, exactly. Journalists thought that interviewing him would be boring. They basically looked at his TV persona and they probably said he's going to be too boring for interviews. We're not going to sell copy on this, so we're not going to bother. And unfortunately, that likely thought process resulted in us not knowing as much about Bob Ross as we could have, which is really unfortunate because I would wager he probably had a very interesting life that would just be fascinating to learn about.
With Egg magazine, who specifically sought him out because they realized nobody knew anything about him, Ross sheepishly admitted that he liked to stay hidden, adding that he was sort of hard to find. In fact, Ross was so hard to find that PBS once lost track of him. It would seem few, if anybody, noticed, until Ross called them to let them know he'd moved to Orlando after the fact. As a result of Ross's love of privacy, coupled with the apathetic attitude of interviewers back then, details about his life are notoriously hazy and difficult to nail down, to the point that even the book, Happy Clouds, Happy Trees, The Bob Ross Phenomenon, chronicling his life and career, was in the end forced to admit that their text is about an understanding we have of Bob Ross and his life. If we had wanted to write an accurate biographical book on Bob Ross, that goal would have been difficult to accomplish. A further hurdle for those looking to write about Ross is that his company, Bob Ross Inc., today is fiercely protective of their intellectual property and Bob Ross's privacy, even in death. One of the few things they've authorized that would come close.
So maybe it wasn't. So maybe it wasn't that they were just unassuming. Maybe he deliberately did keep a low profile and tried to stay out of the press. Because if you saying that he was far hard to find, then okay, that kind of that changes a little something. Because, you know, I figured like they probably just assumed he was boring, but his statement earlier said, you know, he tries to lead a quiet, hidden life. Because that was a quote, Cortana, they said, is, where was it? I never turned down requests for any, I'm just rarely asked, but he's rarely asked because he stayed kind of hidden. He kind of kept private. So it's, yeah, well, and I can certainly respect that he didn't want to be in the limelight, getting snap of cameras or anything like that. I can certainly respect that. It's, well, again, I agree. Like, you know, the one of the few interviews he did, why didn't they do an in-depth one? Who knows? I don't.
To an official biography of his life is a documentary titled Bob Ross, the Happy Painter, that can be viewed by pledging money to PBS or by tracking down a copy of the DVD, which is exactly what we did to fill in some of the gaps for this video. Finally, although Ross was a notable public figure who did a lot of charity work and met with hundreds, if not thousands of people over his lifetime, he only had
and Lonely Healer, you're right. That was what I initially assumed is, he basically showed you how to do paintings and was very calm and soothing, and so it wasn't be interesting. But according to what they just said, he also tried to, he also led something of a withdrawn life outside of the TV. I assumed that it was because it would not be considered interesting. We're seeing conflicted there. So
a handful of close friends who understandably don't like discussing his life out of respect for his privacy. In fact, some of the only known interviews with Ross's family and friends about him can only be found today in the documentary mentioned previously. With that out of the way, let's talk about the little we do know definitively about Bob Ross's life and how he became the cultural icon that he is today. Born in Daytona, Florida in 1942, Ross was the child of a carpenter, Jack, and a waitress, Ollie, who separated, married other people, separated from those new partners, and then got married to each other again, all before their son had hit his teens. As a child, Ross entertained himself by caring for injured animals, much to the chagrin of his parents, who soon became used to coming home to find an injured alligator in their bathtub or an armadillo running around Ross's.
Shit, was Bob Ross the original Florida man? I think Bob Ross may have been one of the original Florida men. Gator in the bathtub, that's Florida man behavior.
Room. Education-wise, Ross left school in the 9th grade to support himself as a carpenter with his father, during which time he lost the tip of his left index finger in an accident, an injury he later hid from viewers most of the time with his paint palette. When he hit age 18, Ross joined the Air Force, which saw him relocated from Florida to Alaska. As far as we can tell, one of the few times Ross spoke openly about his time with the Air Force was in 1990, in a sit-down interview with the Orlando Sentinel, where he explained that he disliked the job because it forced him to be mean, noting that he was the guy who makes you scrub the latrine, the guy who makes you make your bed, the guy who screams at you for being late to work. In stark contrast to the quiet, reserved nature Ross displayed on his show, in the Air Force he developed a reputation as a bit of a bullbuster, earning him the nickname Bust 'em Up Bobby from his subordinates. During his 20-year tenure with the Air Force, Ross developed a taste for painting after attending an art class at the Anchorage USO Club. Luckily, he found himself to be a natural, as he frequently found himself at odds with painting instructors at the many art classes he attended. You see, most of them were more interested in abstract painting, which was in vogue at the time. In Ross's own words, they'd tell you what makes a tree, but they wouldn't tell you how to paint a tree. Eventually, Ross found inspiration after watching a show called The Magic of Oil Painting, hosted by artist Bill Alexander. Alexander touted a style of painting dating back to the 16th century called
Oh my god! Chat, look at the shot. Look at the shot. I wonder if not only was his artistic influence by this man, but the design of the show and the shot production. The framing is almost identical. Oh wow, yeah, I mean, you could really see the influence here.
alla prima, an Italian term meaning first attempt, that allowed him to churn out a painting in a little under half an hour. Alla prima is better known in the art world as wet on wet, because it literally involves applying many layers of wet paint to a single canvas to create an image. During a typical episode of The Magic of Oil Painting, Alexander would create a single painting, invariably a landscape of some sort, over the course of half an hour, while slowly walking viewers through the process. Ross would later use an almost identical format for his show, The Joy of Painting, which greatly annoyed Alexander. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. After observing Alexander's
Bob Ross liked it wet.
Well, Kanita, all guys should like it wet. This is just common sense, Gabe. If you don't like it wet, I don't know what to tell you.
Technique and learning to use it himself, Ross began earning extra money by painting and then selling Alaskan mountainsides painted on the inside of novelty gold pans. Before long, Ross became fairly famous with locals for his talents and would often give demonstrations to children and to the elderly. After a while, Ross began making more money from selling paintings and offering people art lessons than he was from his day job in the military. As a result, Ross left the Air Force
Not
after
a
2
surprise
decades
there.
of service, supposedly quipping that he would never yell or raise his voice again. After leaving the Air Force, Ross returned to Florida in the early 1980s, intent on seeking out Bill Alexander to learn the finer points of wet-on-wet painting. Alexander, who was an art teacher in his spare time, happily taught Ross everything he knew about painting, blissfully unaware that he was training his soon-to-be arch-nemesis. It seems it was a missed opportunity that they never created a show called Artist Deathmatch, pitting themselves against one another in episodic pair-offs. Viewers could then call in to vote in on whose painting was the best in a given episode, master or apprentice, with
Okay, but that wouldn't sit with the characterization of Bob Ross. I would much rather see a show where the two of them would come together and paint side by side while talking about painting and, each of them offering their own inputs into, the painting, the style, the technique, and have them literally doing it side by side. I think that would have been, especially given Bob Ross. I don't know about Alexander. I don't know what his style was in terms of like his personality. But with Bob Ross, I think it would be far better. The two of them working together in tandem with one another.
the winner getting to destroy the other's losing painting in an ever more elaborate way. Wow, that thing basically writes itself. Now, in any event, after a few months of lessons, Ross was offered a job with the Alexander Magic Art Supplies Company as a traveling tutor. While working for the company, Ross's hypnotic, soporific voice and gentle prodding style that emphasized that there were no mistakes, just happy accidents, caught the attention of a lady called Annette Kowalski, who later admitted that she was simply mesmerized by Ross's personality. After a few lessons with Ross, Kowalski became convinced that if she could somehow package the experience of painting with him, she and Ross could make a fortune. After meeting with Kowalski and her husband, Ross was convinced to leave the Alexander Magic Art Supplies Company and set up his own teaching business. Kowalski was so sure of the success of this venture that she sunk her entire life savings into it. In its first year of operation, though, the business lost $20,000, which is about $45,000 today. Now with money tight, Ross made the bizarre decision to have his hair permed, exchanging the military crew cut he'd sported for 2 decades for his now iconic afro. Ross's reasoning was that if he permed his hair, he'd save money in the long run because he'd no longer need to pay to have his hair trimmed once a week. Ross kept the fro for the rest of his life, though he grew to dislike it in his later years. According to Kowalski, Ross's afro was such a radical departure from his previous look that many of his old Air Force buddies watching the show only knew for sure it was him because of the missing bit of his finger. Exactly how Ross went from perming...
Actually, I wonder... So the missing tip of his finger was the left hand, right? So it's the one holding the palette. Okay. That's why you can't really see it.
Radical departure from his previous look that many of his old Air Force buddies watching the show only knew for sure it was him because of the missing bit of his finger. Exactly how Ross went from perming his hair to save $5 to being on TV isn't clear, and there are 2 conflicting stories about how Ross came to the attention of PBS. The version recounted in the aforementioned PBS biopic of his life states that Ross films a commercial for the network with his former mentor, Bill Alexander, promoting his art classes, and this commercial just so happened to catch the eye of the right executive. Another otherwise reputable version of this story states that Kowalski filmed one of Ross's 30-minute lessons and sent it to the network, who liked it enough to greenlight a pilot. It's even possible that both of these things are true. Whatever the case, it seemed that Ross flawlessly executed on the so-called Steve Martin method to success: be so good they can't ignore you. When the time came to film the first episode of Drive Painting, Ross made the conscious decision to speak as though he were talking to a singular viewer, giving the illusion that he was giving a private lesson. Although the set for the Drive painting was positively
Nice.
Spartan, a deliberate decision on Ross's behalf so as not to distract from the painting, a great deal of thought went into almost every aspect of the show. For example, Ross spent significant time picking out what clothes he'd wear on air because he didn't want any clothing that would date the episodes. As a result, Ross almost exclusively wore jeans and a casual shirt throughout the show's run, a look he felt would be current regardless of how many years later an individual episode was aired. Another,
He's
less
not
noticeable
wrong.
thing Ross did was lightly sand his palette prior to filming so that it didn't reflect any of the lights in the studio. In the first few episodes, he actually opted for a translucent palette for the same reason. Although the official Bob Ross website claims that episodes of The Joy of Painting weren't rehearsed, this isn't exactly true, something that becomes immediately obvious when you realize that Ross began every episode by saying exactly which colors he was going to use. Ross actually painted 3 copies of almost every painting ever featured on the show. A first that was painted beforehand and used for reference while filming, a second that was painted during the show itself, and a third that was painted afterwards with a photographer, allowing them to get good shots for the many painting books Ross released and sold. Speaking of which, Ross was never actually paid for appearing in the show, and he never sold a single painting featured on it. The show was instead used as a vehicle to promote Ross's teaching business, interest in which exploded after the show first aired. Over time, the business expanded to include Bob Ross branded brushes, paint, supplies, etc., all making Ross a millionaire. As for his paintings, with the exception of the ones he sold to tourists during his time in Alaska, Ross gave away virtually all of them made during the show's 403-episode run. As for the thousands of other paintings Ross made during his life, many of them were similarly given away, or when Ross became a household name, given to various charitable causes to be auctioned off. Ross also disliked the idea of displaying his art in a museum or gallery, stating, "Most painters want recognition, especially by their peers. I achieved that a long time ago with TV. I don't need anymore." In fact, during his lifetime, Ross only ever allowed one public institution to display his work, the Ministry Cultural Centre in Muncie. Old habits, as they say, are hard to break, and Ross was secretive to the end, hiding the fact that he'd been diagnosed with lymphoma in the 1990s from everyone but his closest friends and family. Ross continued painting almost until his final days, filming his show until 1994, just a year before he died at the age of 52. His final
he
resting
died
place
so
is
young.
marked-
Oh, I did not know that he died so young. Like 52? Even in the 90s, 52 was young. I want to say that in the mid-90s, the average median age of someone, like people were living to like probably mid-70s. Early to mid-70s in the mid-90s. So 52, wow, he was young when he died. Oh, that is heartbreaking. Man. Oh,
94,
God.
just a year before he died at the age of 52. His final resting place is marked by a simple stone marker that reads, "Bob Ross, television artist." So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Brand new videos every day of the week. Also, over there on the right, a couple of other videos that you might enjoy if you enjoyed this one, and thank you for watching.
Oh. That was interesting to find out about Bob. Find out a little bit. Unfortunately, what we found out is a great deal of it is still shrouded in mystery. Unfortunately, we did get a little bit more, but man, that's like Bob Ross is some.
Beat the devil out of it.
Oh, Revan, perfect. That was perfect. Although I'm not sure how I feel about Bob Ross whacking my boobs with the paintbrush. But if anyone's gonna whack my boobs with a paintbrush, I will gladly allow it to be Bob Ross.